The cataclysm between Israel and Hamas is kicked into high gear as what we see now is Palestine is being mandated to be evacuated in the northern strip. Let's go ahead and jump into the insanity of what's going on. Let's go. Breaking from Simona Tiba, Israel has just told the United Nations that all of northern Gaza and 1.1 million people in the area should evacuate within 24 hours or face the consequences. What they are saying is practically impossible. They want them to evacuate through the borders of Jordan and Egypt, and it will not be something that is feasible. There will be a mass casualty report, the likes of which we have not seen since, I would argue, the Iraq War, if Israel truly goes through with this. Something that is now trending on Twitter because of these actions that are being talked about by Israel and the I.D.F. is Gaza genocide. And well, people like Norman Finklestein, who is an absolute expert, he is a Jewish scholar who has studied the Holocaust and the history of persecutions when it comes to completely wiping people off the face of the earth, and he understands the nature of what it means to push an ethnic cleansing, I would argue, better than anyone in the world, because he has studied it to such a degree. His family died in the Holocaust, and he is someone who understands the nature of how this starts, the metrics that are pushed, and the standards of how we start dehumanizing people and what that leads to. Let's go ahead and continue on with this. Many fear that if civilians in Gaza continue to be bombed, this might lead to a regional war and perhaps World War III, as no one knows how Russia, China, Iran, and the rest of the world would react. This may just bring about a new world order and nuclear weapons being used. Like all wars, the beginning is always simple. The most powerful nation vows to obliterate the enemy within days, but then it lasts years, sometimes 20 years like in Afghanistan, and even after 20 years, no one wins, but many people die. And what happened in Afghanistan? We had 20 years of war that was ginned up after a lie about WMDs. And what we're seeing now is we're going to have another war that is only going to continue further the persecution of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government, as well as what will further lead to the deaths of so many poor Israeli citizens, because Hamas will only further activate their terror cells and push these actions. What we see is today, Friday the 13th, the former leader of Hamas was calling for a global day of jihad. So let's pray that we see no further actions being taken so any people are hurt. I really do not wish to see anything happen outside of this conflict zone, because that will only further activate and push this conflict to that of being something akin to World War III, as Simona Tiba references. But there's something that needs to be talked about. When we're talking about World War III and things like World War II and even just history in general, we need to look at this through the understanding the long arc of history. When you're someone who's living in the moment, many a times you don't realize you're living through history until after the fact, until the grains of sand have created the heap. And with that, you understand the impediment that has been presented in front of you. And I genuinely believe we may already be upon the precipice of World War III when you see global scale conflict like that of NATO trying to acquire Ukraine, pushing this conflict further over the course of this long interaction that we've had throughout the Ukrainian and Russian government, and all of the, let's say, delicacy that has handled all of the upper echelon of their politics when it came to the consistent overthrow of their governments, US and NATO placing their envoys within those governments, and this is what ginned up Vladimir Putin to end up invading a place like Ukraine, because he saw that what they were doing was making Ukraine a de facto NATO state. It does not excuse Vladimir Putin's barbaric actions and the civilians that he has killed and the lives that he has taken through his pursuit to take this land, but we have to understand the historical context and why they believe, through their mindset, they are purely justified in doing so. Because as I referenced the United States and NATO as the world empire, Vladimir Putin very much sees himself as being a bulwark against that. But that does not justify your actions in killing civilians to dominate territory. Alrighty, let's go ahead and move on. When it speaks about World War III, and when I say move on, we're going to go ahead and continue on with our understanding of analyzing how this could be World War III that we're possibly living in now. So what do we have after the NATO conflict with Ukraine and Russia? We have the possibility of conflict with China and Taiwan, and many of the politicians throughout the entire neoconservative establishment talking about how we have to defend Taiwan because they are so valuable and so vital, and Taiwan is an important democratic resistance to the entire world and the bulwark that is communist China. China not even being entirely communist, using markets to further bolster themselves to make sure they have a more stable footing. Also, China already being that of a ghost economy, I would argue is not the great threat that many people expect them to be. They are as hollow as we are, if not more, and with that, that means if one pillar comes tumbling, the entire thing will. And now, what do we see? We see the possibility of a conflict throughout the entirety of the Middle East being fought over a New Age holy war, which is that of the Holy Land of Jerusalem. And we see people like the Taliban talking about how they will gladly march on Jerusalem to help fight with the Palestinians, to fight Israel if they are given safe passage. We see Iran that is apparently speaking out. We see the Hamas fighters thanking Hezbollah and Iran for funding their attack on Israel. And what does this mean? We have global scale conflict across the entire planet. And that means this is only going to gin up further, which could lead to the fact that these wider wars end up leading to growing alliances that become entrenched powers, and that will lead to the global scale conflict that we could see coming in the future. Alrighty. He says, like all wars, the beginning is simple, and it always is. Because there's always something that's sold to the populace to gin them up into a fervor that allows them to be propagandized even more into the state of willing to allow innocent people to die solely for the cause of nation states pushing their standards. Moving on to Joshua Smith, and I agree with this every single word. I wanted to put this out there because I feel like it's important to show the sentiment that many people have, and it's not just myself. I don't stand with Hamas. I don't stand with the I.D.F. I stand with the innocent children and the families who have to be the victims of your pointless wars so you can try and prove superiority. Set your differences aside. Stop the death and destruction. God bless all the people who needlessly die because of your egos. And now on to Elijah Schaffer. Elijah Schaffer, who is someone who is basically excommunicated from conservative media because he wasn't towing the line when it came to many of the talking points. I really respected him for that because I wondered for a while if Elijah was hiding his power level, and to see him really come out and be brazen and honest about so many things that many people within the media establishment that he was within the bubble of would not allow him to talk about, while him pushing these standards is what made him leave that, going independent and then being picked up by the Gateway Pundit. Elijah does some pretty good commentary. I don't agree with him on everything, but he's quite entertaining. He has a great interview with Scott Horton about the history of Palestine. Well worth a watch. I will leave that in the description down below. Please go check it out. He says, Gaza is going to get fucked up in the next 7 days in ways you never knew was possible. All masks will be off. You will see just how bad it can get. Republicans will sanction it, the evil bastards. Bookmark this. Also, I hate Hamas, but that doesn't justify anti-Palestinian war crimes. That's absolutely true. And now on to Clint Russell of Liberty Lockdown. Over 1 million Palestinians have less than 18 hours now to flee with all their earthly possessions to the south because Israel's preparing a ground invasion. Before this happens, I just want you to know, and anyone who supports this, you have lost your humanity. You are a broken human. And then we see Ryan Dawson saying Israel is a terrorist state. Now on to Cassandra McDonald, and this is how I was aware of the Gaza genocide hashtag. She put, "Stop the Gaza genocide, enough is enough," by posting a quote of Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who is now effectively being tortured into insanity to his death by the world empire and the regime because he dared speak up about their crimes. He says, "One of the most hopeful things I've seen is that everything I've discovered is that nearly every war that has ever started in the past 50 years has been the result of media lies. The media could have stopped it, and if they had searched deep enough. If they hadn't reprinted government propaganda, they could have stopped it." And that is hopeful, because what we see now with the proliferation of information on Twitter gives us the ability to counter the narrative from the corporate press, because we have a capacity to have the free flow of information without the impediments of the establishment saying what we are and are not allowed to talk about. And with that, it destroys the ability for the narrative and the regime to purport their standards consistently, even on their own channels, because we have the access to information in real time, and we can make up our own minds by making our own corollary perceptual understandings before they can even craft the narrative to deliver it at your doorstep. Now, we're going to go ahead and jump into this, and this is Pat Buchanan. It says, Pat Buchanan warns in 2009 that brothers of little girls killed by Israel during the bombing of Gaza that year would grow up to join Hamas and fight Israel. Well, it's 14 years later and they've grown up. Michael Tracy is the one who posted this, and Michael Tracy's pretty spot on. Again, another person I disagree with on some stuff, but realistically, who cares? If you're good on the issues that matter, then that's all that matters to me. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip, and much like Ron Paul, Pat Buchanan absolutely spot on.
The Israelis have been hit for 6 months with these little rockets, which didn't kill anybody. It was outrageous, cruel, and stupid, and they triggered a blitzkrieg against the Palestinians in Gaza, which in my judgment is an Israeli concentration camp where 1.5 million people are locked up, cannot come out or go in. They've been controlling food, electricity, fuel, and the innocent people in Gaza are the ones suffering.
Concentration camp, doesn't that diminish the significance of the real concentration camps?
No, I'm not talking about a death camp. I'm talking about what the British had in concentration camps in South Africa, and what the Spanish had in Cuba, and what others have had, where they bring all these people, lock them in there, and treat them with great cruelty and a humanitarian disaster, despite what Zippy Livni says. Well, let me tell you. I tell you how you create people for Hamas. You kill 675 people, you wound and injure 3,000. What do you think the brothers and sisters, those 5 little girls that died, what are they going to be when they grow up? What are these people under this, treated like this?
You know.
Look, why do you think the Palestinians...
You know and I know that Hamas's doctrine, I can talk about it right here,
I know their
is to
doctrine.
hide in schools, in mosques, to hide among the civilians and use civilians for shields. And you know it is a war crime to use civilians for shields. You should be criticizing those war crimes on the part of Hamas.
Look, Hamas, any war crimes, I criticize their attacks with those rockets, stupid and cruel. But you sit here and tell me that the Israeli people or the Israeli nation have treated the Palestinian people with any kind of justice. Those towns hit by the rockets are former Palestinian towns.
Well,
Ashkelon, Ashdod,
speaking of
Sderot.
Pat Buchanan being one of the great paleoconservative thinkers of our age. I disagree with him on a fair amount, but it doesn't matter as long as you understand the real issues that are facing humanity and you understand the threats to liberty. We can work on the little things we disagree on after we've solved the problem that is the real threat. Let's go ahead and get into this thread from Sovereign Braun. I thought this was genuinely fantastic. A great compartmentalization of all of the things that many people have been thinking, and he is a perfect representation of what someone who does not trust the establishment is saying right now. Because, well, what he sees and what he clearly understands is that the establishment will use any crisis to their ends to achieve a standard that they desire. And we saw this throughout COVID, we saw this throughout the Middle East, with World War II, with Pearl Harbor, and so many different instances throughout all of the different actions that the intelligence agencies have had their hands in throughout the entirety of their existence. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get into this. Sovereign Bra says, I've kept an eye on the Israel situation for the past few days. Here's what I've learned, and here are my blunt and honest thoughts. 1. Israel chose to ignore intelligence from Egyptian officials about a major attack coming from Hamas. 2. Multiple former I.D.F. soldiers and Israeli intelligence personnel have come forward online and said there's a 0% chance Israel was unaware of this attack beforehand or couldn't have prevented it. 3. We just watched unsophisticated terrorists on hang gliders soar into one of the most heavily defended and surveilled countries on the planet. 4. Within 48 hours of the attack, we are now suddenly seeing an enormous support for an American war with Iran and the genocide of the Palestinian people. I'm witnessing American pastors and formerly level-headed influencers in our world completely lose their minds and call for genocide. It's unsurprising but insane to watch. If the events of the past 3 years have taught me anything, it's that when people get whipped into an emotional frenzy, critical thinking completely goes out the window. People become highly suggestible and will rush to extremely dangerous conclusions without thinking about the consequences. And he's so right about this, because when you're whipped into an emotional frenzy, well, what happens? You are so much more susceptible to external stimuli, and that means you can be propagandized so much easier because your threat adept responses are lowered because you are so much more scared when it comes to the nature of worrying about your survival. And if you are so worried about survival, then that means your ability to, I would say, focus on every single facet of what you need to focus on rather than just the threat at hand that's been presented is completely diminished. Alrighty, moving on. I think this is what we're all witnessing when it comes to the situation in Israel, he says. I'm reminded of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. In both scenarios, the American government received intelligence in the advance of those attacks, but chose not to prevent them. Why? The American government was willing to sacrifice American lives of citizens in order to advance its geopolitical goals. Pearl Harbor gave the justification for World War II. 9/11 gave the justification to invade the Middle East and drastically expand American military-industrial complex and our surveillance apparatus. They were brutally and extremely traumatic events for the American public to witness. The emotional trauma caused people to get whipped into an emotional frenzy. People wanted one thing in response to those attacks: the blood of our enemies. I see the same psyop playing out now. People are whipped into a frenzied bloodlust. In their frenzied bloodlust, people are overlooking some seriously important facts here. Notably, 1. the fact that none of this adds up. 2, innocent civilians are being threatened with genocide. And 3, escalated violence in the Middle East and a war with Iran both risk the rest of the planet getting dragged into World War III. As I've already talked about, we may already be on the fronts of possibly even being in this conflict already. What happened in Israel this weekend was obviously gut-wrenching and awful to witness, but I do not trust Israel's so-called intelligence failure, nor do I trust the snakes in Washington calling for a war with Iran, and I sure as hell no longer trust the emotionally frenzied influencer class calling for explicit genocide of innocent civilians. There was a defining moment in history that we just witnessed, similar to COVID, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and the beginning of the Ukraine war, etc., and a lot of people just got played. Hard. People responded to going full mask off, exposing themselves as reckless and incapable of exercising sound judgment in moments of chaos and heightened emotion, and we're now at the brink of World War III because of it. This was all for nothing. This is a high likelihood that it will lead to more chaos and the rest of this throughout the entirety of the decade. There will be more psychological operations afoot. There will be more moments in time which cooler heads ought to prevail, but people will get whipped into an emotional frenzy instead. Keep your wits about you and be cautious in whom you allow yourself to be influenced by. Recognize that governments and intelligence agencies spend enormous resources waging psychological operations on social media nonstop when stuff like this goes down. Remember, when chaos is at its peak, history shows there is almost always a hidden agenda being played out, and that hidden agenda is always designed to prey on our base emotions to facilitate the desired end result. Pray for world peace tonight. Thank you. And that was just genuinely fantastic. I thought this thread was a 10 out of 10, so I had to go ahead and include it here. And we're going to go ahead and jump into this clip now from Norman Finklestein. This was posted by Keith Woods, and this was on the Jimmy Dore Show. The Jimmy Dore Show is absolutely fantastic. Jimmy being that more of a socialist, a leftist type. I disagree with him on economics, and I think he's absolutely bonkers when it comes to it. I think he's roughly economically illiterate, but like I said, it doesn't matter because it's all about where you get the issues right. And Jimmy Dore is absolutely right, spot on when it comes to war, just like Craig Postadjar-Dul is, and just like our man Norman Finklestein is. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip. It says, I conclude that the Israeli government has finally figured out the final solution to the Gaza problem. Jewish political scientist Norman Finklestein, the world's foremost expert on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, believes we are witnessing genocide in Gaza. Hashtag Gaza genocide. Let's go ahead and get into this clip.
I hope the social media police will bear in mind it's not me, it's Israel's defense minister who has just announced that they will not allow any electricity.
Mm-hmm.
They will not allow any water.
Mm-hmm.
They will not allow any food. They will not allow any fuel into Gaza.
Yeah.
Now, bear in mind, Benjamin Netanyahu announced yesterday that Israelis should be prepared for a long war. If you put those two statements together, now I ask the social media police to bear in mind, it's not me. I am simply quoting from the Israeli leadership. If you put those two statements together, what it means is there will be no food, no water, no electricity, and no fuel allowed in Gaza for a long time.
Yeah.
So, what do we conclude from that? I conclude that the Israeli government has finally figured out the final solution to the Gaza problem. That's what I conclude, I infer from the information that's being broadcast by this government.
Yeah. Complete and total genocide.
And endorsed not only by President Biden, not only today endorsed by former President Barack Obama, endorsed by the whole squad, so-called, except for Cori Bush.
You heard it straight from the mouth of Norman Finklestein, someone who is an expert on the Holocaust, the history of genocides and ethnic cleansing, and he knows the history of how the people in the world are demonized and whipped up into a state that they are put down to the point where people in society are willing to see them excommunicated from the face of the earth, all solely based on the ideals of the propaganda that is imbibed by the people who consume it. All right, now let's go ahead and jump into this article. And just before we do, I want to lay this out. I'm no expert on what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but I do have a cursory understanding and a decent knowledge of the history of the conflict. But the thing that you can do if you want people who are experts is you can go check out Norman Finklestein. You can go check out people like Scott Horton. He has a fantastic interview with Elijah Schaefer, who we already used in this video, as well as Viva Fry. They will both be linked in the description down below. You can also go check out people like Max Blumenthal, who is an expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Fantastic information. You can also get information if you want a more establishment perspective from someone like RFK Jr., who has a solid well of information, but I would argue approaches this from the wrong perspective. But that doesn't matter. You should go ahead and get a plethora of views so you can go ahead and make up your own mind and come to your own conclusion, because what's most important is that you are a free person who makes up your own mind and does not be inculcated and consumed by the propaganda that is endlessly pushed out by both left and right, and that you are a free person. This is what matters most. And with the possibility of people having the ability to achieve freedom and make up their own mind, hopefully they can see the machinations of the propaganda that is being pushed by the state and many of the different superstructures akin to the media that talk about these conflicts and completely avoid the historical context of what is going on. All right, let's get into the CBS article. Israel warns northern Gaza residents to leave, tells UN 1.1 million residents should evacuate within 24 hours. Israel's military aircraft dropped thousands of leaflets on northern Gaza Strip Friday, warning residents in a part of the Palestinian territory to evacuate its southern half. The Israeli military informed the United Nations late Thursday night that the entire population of northern Gaza should evacuate the south almost immediately. This is 1.1 million people, 50% of them being children, and you are willing to, even if you can't get them out, lay waste to the entire area, and with it, we will see a casualty report that has not been seen in ages when it comes to the registration of what is going on in this conflict. I genuinely fear that we will see numbers dwarf everything else that has happened in the past, and I am honestly terrified for the people of Palestine because of it. And also, I'm terrified for the civilians of Israel because of it, because it will only further gin up Islamic extremism in the region and activate so many different Muslim countries against Israel. Alrighty, now let's go ahead and jump into this article from Al Jazeera, and these articles don't really have too much. The Al Jazeera article does. The article that I'm about to jump into and to finish this off is fantastic, and I would argue it's worth your read if you do not understand the history of Hamas, how they were created. Well worth your time. Alright. Al Jazeera says, Israel orders 1.1 million people in Gaza to move south. What to know? UN warns it is impossible for such a movement to take place without devastating humanitarian consequences. They're absolutely right. So that's just the humanitarian consequences of getting all these people out of this one location and shifting them off into multiple different countries. That's just the resource issues. That's not talking about the death toll that will soon come from the people that were not able to escape this region in time. It's unbelievable. And now on to an article that I would argue anyone that's not familiar with the creation of Hamas, the history of Israel, well worth your time. It will be linked in the description down below as per usual, as will everything that I use in every single video, so you can go ahead and make up your own mind about everything that I'm going through and you can read it for yourself. How Israel helped to spawn Hamas. And we're only going to read a little bit of this because we're only going to jump in a tiny bit, but I want to set the precedent so people can understand what's going on and the things that many of the people like CBS, who we just started this off with, never talk about. Surveying the wreckage of a neighborhood bungalow hit by Palestinian rockets, a retired Israeli official, Cohen, traces the missile's trajectory back to an enormous stupid mistake made 30 years ago. Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation, said Cohen. A Jew who worked in Gaza for more than 2 decades. Responsible for religious affairs in the region until '94, Cohen watched the Islamist movement take shape, muscle aside secular Palestinian rivals, and then morph into what it is today, Hamas, a militant group that is sworn to Israel's destruction. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Go ahead, check out this article. So fantastic, well worth your time. Will give you a great understanding of the history. And here's the thing. What we see now is another blockade has been enacted on Israel and with it, or on Palestine by Israel, and with it, that means that there will be no resources and they will be withholding aid to children. They will be destroying buildings, harming civilians, and removing the ability for those civilians, half of which are children, to be able to have access to resources to take care of their wounds and feed themselves. The fact that Israel is willing to starve children over a persecution of what many are considering a religious war is unbelievable. And for many, it's unconscionable. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely, stay great. Pray for the people who are stuck in this conflict. Peace out.